Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Meet Penguin's Premier Picture Book Creators. I am Ronny Khuri, Booklist Associate Editor, Books for Youth. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. To resize the slides, look to the magnifying glass icons located to the left of the slides. There you can increase or decrease the size and select how you'd like the slides to appear. If you lose audio or would like to change the way you're connected to it, look to the bottom of your screen for a circle with 3 dots. Clicking that icon will open a menu with an audio connection option. If you experience any issues during the webinar, click on FAQ Webinars in the drop-down menu at the top of your WebEx screen to view a PDF with answers to commonly asked webinar questions. If you're in the audience, then you are in listen-only mode, but we do welcome any questions you might have. On the right side of your screen is a control panel with an area at the bottom for Q&A. Simply type your question into the field and click Send. Attendees can see questions asked during the webinar and the answers provided. A link to today's slides was sent directly to you from WebEx at the start of the webinar. But you can also download the slides at any time by copying the URLs on this screen into your web browser. Tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing a link to today's slide presentation along with a certificate of completion. And today we have the pleasure of hearing from Weshoyot Alvitre, illustrator of At the Mountain's Base, John Rocco, illustrator of Camp Tiger, Eliza Wheeler, author and illustrator of Home in the Woods, and Zeke Peña, illustrator of My Papi Has a Motorcycle. And we begin with Weshoyot Alvitre. Weshoyot is a comic book artist and illustrator. She's most recently worked as art director for the video game When Rivers Were Trails, and illustrator on the graphic novel Redrawing History with the Library Company of Philadelphia. Her books have received numerous awards and recognition, including the Eisner Award for Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream, and the Prism Award for Hummingbird Boys in Moonshot Volume 2. She currently resides in Southern California with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Weshoyot. The floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. Guess I'm going to go to the next panel here. The book I will be discussing is the recently published At the Mountain's Base, written by Tracy Sorrell. I received the script for this project as an email, and I was really surprised because it was my very first picture book, and it was a very short poem, very minimalistic, and written in a rounded style, so it was circular and it sort of tied into the beginning of the story once it ended. I really got excited about how I could potentially focus on certain elements within the story. It featured a family who I would assume to be Native American. The author is Cherokee, and I myself am from the Tongva tribe here in California. And so I really wanted to focus on having a Native American family. It also featured weaving. And so in my hobbies on the side of doing artwork, I also spin yarn and weave materials and do fiber art. So it really, really hit home and something that I was very excited to explore. I decided to look into Cherokee culture a little bit, with the author being Cherokee. And so I discovered that they actually have a particular art in their cultural practice called finger weaving. And a lot of the time they would do belts and sashes, and it's something that actually spans across many tribes here in the United States, from Métis to Cherokee and elsewhere, like in New Mexico region. So I decided to focus on the finger weaving techniques. And I did a lot of research into how it's actually done, from spinning the fibers to traditional methods of doing finger weaving, as well as modern methods. I decided to go through some archives in museums and actually found examples of traditional finger weaving patterns. So from there, the finger weaving techniques and also the images online really influenced my color palette, which using a lot of primaries for what I was able to find, it kind of tied into having a sort of a nostalgic 1940s vintage feel. There's a lot of red and yellow used, primary colors, and sort of greens, some blues and blacks and white. This slide here shows some traditional finger weavers doing their handicrafts, and you can see examples in the background. And I wanted to tie it in also with sort of that playful color palette that's used in the 1940s, and it's also mimicked in kind of a childlike element through the blocks, the wood blocks at the bottom. We also decided to do some investigation into women in the military, specifically World War II. And speaking with Tracy, she mentioned that there was a pilot called Ola Mildred Millie Rexcoat, and she was actually Lakota. And she used to fly tow targets for soldiers to practice shooting at. And she was one of the very first women pilots to be used. And she was part of the WASP program in World War II. So that was a lot of our inspiration, doing a lot of research and then finding sort of from color to textural elements that tied together to form sort of the look that we chose for the book. The process that I had for doing the pages is a lot like my comic book work. I have a long history doing comic books. I took methodologies that were comfortable for me to apply to this because it was a little intimidating not knowing exactly what the formula for a children's book was. So throughout the book, you will see panel-to-panel type illustrations, which comes from my comic book background. And I start out doing thumbnails, which you can see at the top left corner. They're usually really rough thumbnails just to get the energy and the feeling of what it is that I want to put down. And some of them have changed over the course of the project of the book. Below the thumbnail image, you can also see sort of a color thumbnail, which helped me to communicate to the editor and the art director the color palette and the feel for each page, and then also to have sort of a color theme running throughout the entire story. And you can see that they're very primary colors sort of in my thumbnail. They're just digital, very quick color sketches. And for the final pages, I decided to go completely traditional method. They're painted in gouache and watercolor and then finished up with ink lines. I tried not to add very heavy ink lines. I wanted to differentiate this from my comic book work, which is very black and white, ink and linear heavy. So I decided to play a little bit more with the ability to use paint because I haven't had that chance yet. We also decided to have a large focus in the book on women in the military. And in focusing in that, I also did some reading into Cherokee heritage and their traditional structure within their community, which is matrilineal. My own tribe is not matrilineal, so it was something to just sort of learn from. But I really wanted to focus on not only the generational aspects of the grandmother in the story, as well as the granddaughter who's learning weaving and sort of handicrafts from her grandma throughout the story. But I also wanted to put a strong emphasis on the different interactions between generations, where you have a very traditional grandmother, perhaps, who's, taught traditional textile weaving to her children and also language and potentially songs, but how that changes generation to generation. So it's very female heavy. It's very oriented towards the matrilineal side of the family and sort of the dynamics of that. In this picture, it's a reference from the actual pilot, Millie Rexcoat, who was Oglala Lakota. That was actually a photograph of her on the top left, and I decided to do a little homage to her in a couple of the pages in the illustrations to get it looking like her somewhat photorealistically as a nod. So we tried to incorporate her into the story. And you can see the portrait into the thumbnails and the original pencils. And then this is the final piece. I also wanted to talk about drawing from life. I tried to incorporate some personal elements into this book, it being my first children's book and also having something that was comfortable to me because it was a little intimidating jumping into this new world of, experimenting with different medias, mixed media, not having like a set format like comic books is kind of a set format visually. At the time of doing this book, my grandmother was in the hospital. So I was doing a lot of back and forth between finishing pages and taking my dad down to see her and then kind of updates weekly on her health. And she was a huge part of my life growing up. She used to knit us hats, and she'd always send knitted projects to all of the grandkids like throughout us growing up. And she also helped me learn knitting when I was a kid, which has turned into like a lifelong love of fibercraft. My mom's also a seamstress, so I had it from both aspects of my family, but I really wanted to sort of honor my grandma in this and the respect that I have for her and the things that I remember watching her do when I was little, because I always remember she had her hands busy doing something. If it wasn't knitting, it was crocheting or sewing or, things, and she'd send me photocopies out of her knit books and stuff when I was small. So you can see sort of just the relationship that I pulled from memories that I had as a kid of watching her hands do things. And this was one of the last photos that we got to take before she passed away last year. So. I also wanted to bring this in as far as pulling things from my actual life that made me feel comfortable in this new space to explore artwork. I was actually born and grew up on the National Park property of Zeke Peña, which is located in Newbury Park, California. And I actually grew up at a mountain base until I was 5 years old. My dad, he used to run the cultural center, and he helped build it from scratch in the early 80s. And it's still in existence today. We were a single house sort of with an attached museum and just out on miles and miles of open space and property. So I really wanted to kind of focus on that. And it helped to take away the anxiety over, am I doing this right? Is the artwork looking okay? By having something familiar that I could really, relate to and that I had fond memories of growing up. So I tried to, it doesn't look exactly like the photo of the place that I grew up, but I did pull a lot of elements from that and things that I remember with the trees and the land and stuff. So I was thinking a lot about that while I was creating this book.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Weshoyot. And next up, we have John Rocco. John is the #1 New York Times bestselling author and illustrator of many award-winning books for children, including the Caldecott honor-winning picture book, Blackout. He is also the illustrator for the internationally best-selling series, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Kane Chronicles, The Heroes of Olympus, and Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard. His most recent titles include the fully illustrated version of Percy Jackson and the Olympians and Big Machines, the story of Virginia Lee Burton. John lives in Rhode Island with his wife, daughter, 2 wild cats, and 1 very rambunctious dog named Lucy. Thanks for being here, John.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. And thanks for everyone who tuned in today to listen to us talk about books. So I got this manuscript about a year ago called Camp Tiger. And when I first read it, I wasn't sure what to think about it. It was really quite an interesting and different manuscript for me. And the more I sat with it, the more I thought, this is really, really cool. And I can't wait to illustrate it. The story is about a little boy who's going on the last camping trip of the summer with his family before he enters first grade. And he's kind of terrified of first grade, doesn't want to grow up, doesn't want to have to do things for himself. He's kind of used to being taken care of. And, I can kind of remember some of that from my childhood, going to Hampton Meadows School, walking to school, first grade, and really kind of worried about what it was going to be like. And so as this boy goes through this process, this camping trip, a tiger comes to their campsite. And when I read the manuscript, I thought, okay, this is unusual. Where are they camping? That a tiger shows up, and suddenly I realized this tiger's not necessarily real, but he kind of is. So I found this challenge in just reading the manuscript, like, how am I going to pull this off where the tiger is real, or at least very real to the boy, but he could be this magical, mystical spirit animal, if you will. And so as I dug in, I started to, make sketches, really loose thumbnails. This is basically how I will work on a book. Is I like to lay out the entire book on one piece of paper and sketch it all out to make sure that I have a good balance of full-page spreads and spots and things like that. And so as you can see here, there's even a repetition, I think, of a spread by accident. But anyway, the idea for me is to see the flow of the book. How is it going to go from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, and how are we going to feel all the emotions that this kid feels? How can I use light, color, and the visuals, including the negative space, to help tell the story? So as I was working on this book, my daughter came home from school, and she had this pencil in her hand, and she had been using it for a school assignment, and I said, let me see that thing. And it was called a General Sketch Wash Pencil. Now, I normally always use a regular graphite pencil on paper, and I do a full tonal drawing, and then I'll scan it into the computer and paint digitally while still adding some textures and some watercolor backgrounds that I create to get final color. But this Sketch Wash pencil, it's a graphite pencil. You can use it on watercolor paper, and then you can use a brush, a wet brush, or they have these special brushes that hold the water in the handle, and you could just squeeze the water into the fibers of the brush. And you can move this graphite lead around like watercolor paint. And I thought, this is incredible. And I tried it. I practiced using it, and I really liked it. So first, I'm just showing you an example of a small little doodle. So first I start with a loose, light pencil sketch, and then I'll go in with the General Sketch Wash pencil, make it a little darker, add some lead onto the page, and then you can take a watercolor brush, or in this case I have these special brushes that hold the water in the handle so you don't have to keep dipping it. You can just squeeze it when you want more water out. And once that dries, you can go back into it and add more detail and add more dark color. And for me, it was suddenly this breakthrough moment because I wasn't so tight. I could allow these like little accidents with the watercolor to happen, and it worked really well for me, especially with the landscape that I wanted to create, this world where, not so different from the little mountain you just showed, Weshoyot, to this landscape that this story takes place in. I wanted it to be sort of perhaps the Northwest, or even could be the Northeast, but somewhere in the North, where I camped a lot as a kid in Maine and New Hampshire, and I'm reminded of some of the different landscape that was there. But you can see with this General Sketch Wash pencil, I was able to create this sort of wash as opposed to very tight line work that I normally do with my pencil. And then I scan that into the computer, and I can then add color that way. And you can see I also add textures. So there's a watercolor texture that is underneath the mountain, the cliff side, that kind of adds more layering and texture to it. But normally the color that I'm adding underneath is fairly flat, and I let the tonal work of the original drawing do all the heavy lifting, and then I'm just adding the color. So this pencil really sort of created this whole new process for me, which was a lot of fun. And I was able to kind of use it in a way that I hadn't worked before. And I found it really helps with, painting fur and things like that. But as you can see from this painting, again, lighting was really important to me. Coming from more of a film background, I am able to sort of draw from all the things that I learned about color and lighting and setting a mood and using those tools to help accentuate what's going on in the story. And that's always been an important part of my bookmaking. So this is a scene where the boy is in the tent with the tiger for the first time there alone, and I wanted to capture that feeling of the light dappling in from the trees into the tent and giving them kind of their own space. And that's why I chose to do a full page spread to really give it that kind of moment where they're first talking to each other. This is another spread from our one page from the book. And you can see here how I've used negative space to help create a strong silhouette and a stillness to what's happening in the scene. They're going out on the canoe and the tiger comes along, but he's staring back at the shore the whole time. Negative space can do a lot of different things for you as an illustrator. It can create, a place to put the words, but it also can create a sense of a place for the eye to rest. It can create a quieter moment. So you can use these things, these different uses of the white page to add those moments into your story. I'm going to show you one last spread here, and this is more of an action type spread. So, it's a full bleed out to the edges, lots of action. This is obviously the tiger jumping into the water. And this was kind of a tricky illustration because I still wanted to show the boy, but I wanted to be down in the water with the tiger. And of course, there's some space over to the right for all the text to go. And this is one of the more fun illustrations. They were all fun to do, but this one was particularly fun. A tiger underwater, and there's so many great photos of tigers underwater. Apparently, they just love to swim around. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it over to my friend, Eliza.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. And I will introduce our next presenter, Eliza Wheeler. Eliza wrote and illustrated New York Times bestseller Miss Maple Seeds and has also illustrated several picture books, including This Is Our Baby, Born Today by Varsha Bajaj, and novels including Newbery Honor winner Dollbones by Holly Black. She grew up in northern Wisconsin in a family of teachers, musicians, and artists. Some of the strongest influences on her creativity have been the wild Wisconsin seasons, canoeing the Brule River, picking blueberries with her grandmother, and digging through the snow with her brothers. She received the SCBWI Los Angeles International Conference Portfolio Grand Prize for her artwork. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Take it away, Eliza.
All right. Thank you so much. This is so cool. I'm really engrossed in the other presentations. Um, yeah, so my book, new book, Home in the Woods, which I also wrote, is based on my grandma's true story from when she was 6 years old and her newly widowed mother and eight kids becoming homeless and finding this abandoned tar paper shack in the middle of the woods and making it into a home. When I start working on the artwork, I always start by collecting a lot of reference photos and inspiration imagery. And for this book, there are so many great photos from the Depression era, which is when this book takes place. And I was also looking at for the style of the characters, sort of silent movie actors of that time as well. And I was also able to go up and collect reference photos on site of the trees and landscape and sort of capturing the flora and fauna of northern Wisconsin, which helped me make the location of the book feel real and specific to the place that I grew up and the place that my grandma grew up. My process of making the artwork has kind of changed over the years in that I used to work in a little bit more of a straight line from a tiny rough thumbnail sketch to the full-sized refined sketch and then on to the final artwork. But my process of building the artwork has become a lot more organic over time. And I work on a lot of different pieces at once, and those little pieces I'll pull into a hand-bound process book that I make out of different scraps of paper, and that'll have character sketches and story notes, and it'll have thumbnail sketches and different compositional layouts and little painting tests and character refinements for different scenes in the book. And I found that when I used to work in that really direct progression from the small rough sketch to tight sketch to final art, I found that I would get sort of tired with the process. And by the time I got to that final artwork, I was struggling with my final artwork getting too tight. And so I think this organic process has come to me over time, and it helps me stay loose and moving around, and that'll help me sort of save my energy for the final painting. And with the artwork, I'm really trying to, sort of similar to what John mentioned, it's capturing a time and a place, and using color and lighting and shadow and movement to communicate the other senses that are going on in the scene, of what it might sound like or what the temperature is, and to try to give a sense of what the weather might feel like through the colors, and even hopefully sort of give a sense of smells and sounds. For this particular final art piece, I needed some help getting the angle and the lighting right, so I made this little paper mock-up of the shack, and that was I was able to sort of photograph that and then composite it into the sketch so that I could base my refined composition off of that. So I'll go back here. And some of the pages in the book progressed sort of easily and quickly, and I was able to go from thumbnail sketch to making sort of tonal studies, and I'll do those on my iPad, and then do some color studies based on that tonal study, and just testing out how things will look in that final painting. And so on the short end, a painting could maybe take me about a week total to make. And some of the pieces of the artwork go faster, and others, though, take a lot longer to go through. For example, there's this climactic moment in the book where the family's tucked in bed, and it's this winter night. And this was my original thumbnail sketch for that spread. I worked through many different compositions to try to get it right. I realized that there were some problems with that original sketch, which was that I sort of wanted to see the winter night sky and have this kind of epic scene while also seeing the family in the bed, and trying to figure out how to split this image and see two of them, similar, I think, to the tiger in the water and seeing the little boy in the canoe. This wanting to focus both on the mother and the kids and on this winter night sky. So it took me a really long time. This is maybe about 1/10 of the amount of thumbnail sketches I worked through. And at one point I had the composition figured out, but I had not really nailed down the character sketches yet of the mom and the kids, and hadn't feel like I had nailed them down, but I was so ready to paint that night sky. I could just see it so clearly. So I ended up just painting that side of the painting first and finishing it, or nearly finishing it, and then it sat like this for about a month. And luckily over that time, some new photos resurfaced of my great-grandmother and my grandma and her siblings, and some of them I had never seen. So when I saw this photo of my grandma, and she has this, short, stylish haircut, which was, I had been sort of drawing her with more of a low bun in her hair. And once I saw that photo, I just felt like I really connected with this young 34-year-old woman. It's right after the 1920s, and she's got this style, and imagining her having to go do this thing and this survival story, it felt like she came alive for me in that moment. And so I was able to go back in and refine those characters and slowly build it from there. For that final artwork, I start with using dip pens in India ink here, and then I do painting work in watercolors and use acrylic paint and pastels for highlights. And then it's just a slow, steady process of building up the layers of artwork from there. So this spread in the book took way longer than all the others to come together, but it's probably ended up being one of my favorite moments in the book because of how much went into getting it to work right, and feeling like it came together in that more organic way. So that's all from me. I'll pass this on to Zeke.
Thanks, Eliza. I think your work did pay off. It's pretty amazing. So our final presenter will be Zeke Peña. Zeke is a cartoonist and illustrator from El Paso, Texas. He studied art history at the University of Texas at Austin and is self-taught in illustration and painting. He's published work with Vice.com, Latino USA, The Believer magazine, The Nib, Penguin Random House, Holt Macmillan, and Cinco Puntos Press. In 2018, he received the Boston Globe Horn Book Award for a graphic biography he illustrated titled Photographic, The Life of Graciela Iturbide. You can see more of his work at zpvisual.com. Welcome, Zeke.
Hello, everyone. Greetings, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to the people who organized this and are doing all the hard work of getting everyone together. Thank you for everyone for spending some time of your day with us. And then also a special shout out to, I believe it's Mr. Colombo's class, the 5th grade class that's listening into us. I think that's pretty awesome. Nice way to spend your day. So, yeah, let me just go to the next slide here. The book that I'm going to be talking about is My Papi Has a Motorcycle. It was written by my friend and collaborator, Isabel Quintero, and this is the 3rd project that we've collaborated on. Originally, Isabel and I collaborated on her first book, Gabby, A Girl in Pieces, that was published by Cinco Puntos Press. And we collaborated on the cover for that. And so, years later, we kind of noticed that that was a unique thing for a cover illustrator and for an author to, speak to each other even. But we also had the opportunity of kind of figuring out some of the images and talking about the story. So 2 projects later comes this children's book. This is also my first children's book. It was published by a new imprint, Coquila, which is a part of Penguin Young Readers. We were honored to be a part of their first list, featuring kind of marginalized stories. And so, it was great working with them. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the process in the same way that all the other illustrators were talking. I am going to try to keep up with the Q&A, so if you want to shout out something in the Q&A, I'll try to reference it in my talk, even though I can't hear you, but I welcome that. So, so this story is about David Ramona, the character pictured here, and the story comes from Isabel Quintero's childhood. So she would take these motorcycle rides with her dad in the afternoon when her dad would get home from work. And so Isabel had been speaking to me about this story a little bit while she was working on it. I believe she had been working on it for several years before we were able to start, actually working on it together. And I was just really honored and excited to work on this story because it's such a personal thing to her. Also just to honor her family and honor their story. And so that's not something that I take lightly, I want to make sure that I'm doing a good job with it and treating it with respect. And so when we were talking about designing, for David Ramona, we worked collaboratively, so it was just me asking Isabel a lot of questions, like would she wear glasses, would she do this, would she do that? And so that kind of process goes throughout the book. So I thought what I'd do is I'd kind of just focus on one spread in particular. This spread, I really like this spread. It's one of my favorite ones in the book. So this is, as they go, on the motorcycle ride, David Ramona just kind of, calls out the things that she really enjoys and the things in her neighborhood. And she's also kind of making note of some of the things that had changed, in her neighborhood. And so throughout the book, throughout the process of working on the book, it was a matter of Isabel and I collaborating. She sent me some videos, actually, of her driving around the actual neighborhood that she grew up in Corona, California. And, also just me asking her questions. What would this look like? What would that look like? Also going off of my own just kind of experience, visiting Southern California. And then also, making it really specific in that way, but also trying to make it general enough so that other people can relate to it. I'm also pulling things from where I grew up here in El Paso. And so this is a scene of them riding in front of a mural that features some of the migrant workers that were picking the lemons. This neighborhood is known for its agricultural history, and something that Isabel really wanted to do is really honor the people who are, a part of building the neighborhoods that we all live in, providing the food that we all eat. And so this was a nice way to do that and tie it in with the story. Throughout the illustrations, I really just wanted to make it really exciting, really dynamic, and make have a lot of action, a lot of motion. In the same way that Weshoyot was talking about using comics, I was also way more comfortable doing comics. So I utilize a lot of those kind of techniques, panels, speech bubbles, the action, the framing, motion to action to action, excuse me. This is one of the first sketches that we did for our proposal. You can see it's like really rough. I don't really have things figured out, which I think is a good thing to point out, right? That when as illustrators, when we start working on stuff, it doesn't look really good. So I always like to kind of point that out. These are some of the initial character sketches that I worked on for Daisy Ramona. And a lot of this was based off of actual photos that Isabel sent me of her as a girl. So trying to get somewhat of a likeness down, but we also were interested in kind of creating a whole new character that wasn't kind of strictly based on Isabel. So, the glasses thing, I kind of don't know where that came from, but yeah, you can kind of see I'm thinking about height, I'm thinking about, does she have pigtails, thinking about her hair color, the heart earrings, things, just little details like that. This is another character sketch. Unfortunately, the turtle did not make it into the story. We had to edit it out for various reasons, but I hope to bring that turtle into something else. I was able to bring in the bands because Isabel thought it was super important for her to be wearing bands. So Corona has a history of racing in the city, so car racing. It's known for its lemons and agriculture, and also they had a racetrack in the city. Excuse me, it was as a racetrack that the city was then built around and built on eventually. So this poster you're seeing on the left is from actual Corona, like the races. So I was doing a little bit of research about that history and trying to bring that into the book, also, using it as reference for some of the illustrations, and then also using just other references for motion. I randomly just picked this because this was one of the ones that I had in my folder for kind of inspiration, but this is a speed racer. I just really liked the action and a lot of the motion that was in the scene. So starting, with thumbnail sketches, as most of us do. These are really small. These are literally, I think, maybe an inch wide or an inch and a half wide. Here's a close-up of the spread that I'm going to be talking about. And so, yeah, you just see it's really rough. You can see some of the things are mapped in there, just them writing by, this wall, this mural. There was originally a dog that didn't make it. You'll see a little bit of a tighter sketch here. I'm trying to figure out now where I'm putting the type in, thinking about the design of the page. Yeah, so, sorry, I'm also checking the Q&A here as some stuff's going on. Thank you for all your comments and questions. Then this is inks. So I do work primarily analog at first, so pencil on paper in the same way that John was speaking about. I think all of us kind of do that. For me, it's just, I use a lot of digital techniques, but it's just more comfortable for me. And then digital is just so quick, it's easy to edit. So it depends on the timeline. I do prefer analog, but a lot of the times you don't have time to, draw everything by hand, or at least I don't. I haven't yet. So yeah, you see just getting a tighter idea for the spread here, changing things, reshaping things, adding little characters in there, little details, see the caps up top. Then going on to the colors, the colors really bring it to life. I did use some analog watercolor textures that I did by hand, and then I scanned them in. I used that to layer it in just to kind of warm up the feel of the spread. I noticed someone asked something about the bubbles. The bubbles are done digitally. And so, yeah, I think that, that's just kind of the way I work, going back and forth between digital and analog. That was my last spread. So, yeah, I ended a little bit early, but I think that'll be good so that we can get some questions from the people who are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeke. So yes, it is time for the Q&A. We'll keep an eye on the chat box if anyone else has more questions. But otherwise, I will kind of address each illustrator, and we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with Zeke and dig a little deeper. So Zeke, I thought it was really cool to hear about how much you were able to communicate with Isabel, which is, as far as I understand, not a very common thing in collaborations like this. And it was a very personal story for her that you were obviously working hard to communicate. But I have to imagine it was also personal for you on some level, and it'll speak to a lot of people. So can you speak about some of those things you mentioned that you pulled from El Paso, or any other elements that made it more your own or more personal for you?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it is, unique for an illustrator and an author to communicate, which I think is totally weird, but that's not my decision. I mean, that's like a publishing thing, but it's important for me, right? Like, this is Isabel's story, and, like I was just saying at the beginning, I want to, make sure that I'm doing right by it and honoring it. And so we were grateful to the publisher that they provided us the platform and the support to be able to have those conversations. And, Isabel and I are just friends now, so it just makes it really fluid. We support each other, when we're having difficulties kind of working on something. And I think it just makes for a better story. And, who knows that story better than the person who wrote it? So as an illustrator, I just want to ask those questions to the person who wrote it and to the person whose story it is, right? Like, what were you thinking here? What does this look like? What were you visualizing when you wrote this? If those details aren't already in the manuscript. And then in terms of bringing my personal kind of experience to it, that's also important, right? As an illustrator, for me, is that how can I connect to this story in a way? I think that if I can't connect to something, I don't know that I'm necessarily going to work on it because I'm not going to be able to bring anything to it. And so some of the things you'll find in the book, and I should say it's pretty easy, right? Like, it's somewhat easy. Like, we live in the same region, and we live like in kind of like similar, cities, similar like neighborhoods and stuff. So some of the things are like the look of the buildings. I was pulling from El Paso, but also San Antonio, which is where my dad's from. So you'll see there's just like certain things, right? Like chain link fences, like the nopales, the mechanic shop on the spread that I was showing that has both English and Spanish written on it, just to describe what it's doing. And so I think that those details, I guess that connection that I'm making to it, bring up really specific details. And for me as a reader, I'm always thinking about being a reader is like what's interesting to me. And those are the things for me as a reader that I'm really interested in, are those really specific details that kind of draw me in, and those things that you can kind of revisit as you reread the book.
Yeah, that's great. I think the realness really comes through, so it makes a lot of sense that it was so personal for both of you. I'll ask you one more question. Again, based on Isabel's author's note, she said that one of her goals was to shine a light on the people who built our communities, who physically built them, as opposed to the people who the streets are named after. And we get to see a lot of those people kind of in the background through Daisy's journey. The most prominent person around her being her papi. And so in a time where a lot of harmful stereotypes about Latinx people are being proliferated, what did you want to get across in how you represented the people specifically through their figure design and the community as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really say that was something that I was trying to be conscious about. I think that it was just really trying to be true to like Isabel's story and to her experience, right? Like, I think it's important to point out that like we have very different experiences as people growing up, right? And all of us do it. And I think that what I'm interested in is like exploring those differences, right? That not everyone has the same upbringing. And because two people identify in the same way, they can have radically different, upbringings. And so I think that in terms of the representation of the people in the book, it was really simple to just kind of like, look around at the people that, live in our neighborhoods, that live in our cities, the people that we know. And, I draw in a kind of really comic book and cartoonish style in this book. And so I like to exaggerate certain things, people's hair. I like to draw big ears for some reason. I don't know why. And then, to the first part of your question, which was, about, honoring the people that help build our cities, like her papi is one of those people, right? Like he's a home builder, he's a carpenter, and he helps, build homes. And, oftentimes, the people who are building the homes, aren't able to live in the homes that they build. And so I think that for Isabel, I don't want to speak on her behalf, but that was definitely something that was important to her, was that, pointing that out and I guess, showing that, it's like fun, right? Like one of her favorite panels, I think her favorite spread in the book is when she visits her dad's work site, and she gets to talk to all the people that are working with her dad, and yeah, so I think that was something that was really important for her.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I am going to move on to Eliza now. Eliza Wheeler, you spoke a little bit about your organic process with the illustrations and the art, but since you're also the author, I am curious, and you showed those photographs as sort of a starting point as well, but do you have the text ready beforehand? Do you kind of go back and forth between the text and the art? Like, how much do they influence each other, and how do you divide that work?
Yeah, I feel like I do go back and forth a lot with this particular book. I spent more time writing at first as a separate process because I had a general idea of where I was trying to focus, but I think the illustrations come more naturally to me. I would consider myself an illustrator first, and the writing craft has been something I've had to learn and build up more through the years. And so it's interestingly, like the illustration work is more labor intensive, but the writing is in a way more time intensive, just trying to figure out how to get the voice right. And for this particular story, I was really stuck with the writing for many years. It took me about 6 years to write, and it wasn't until I tried writing the story in present tense point of view that it sort of cracked open for me, and the whole story is being told through the eyes of 6-year-old Marvel. So even though it's this historical book, you're getting to sort of be there with her in these fresh experiences, and it seemed to fit the pacing of the illustrations really well. So yeah, I would say for this particular book, it was more unique in that I was spending a lot more time with the writing first, and then once I got it to a place where I had nailed down the structure of the story, then it was a matter of going back and forth between the words and pictures. And once I would get a picture figured out, I would take out words or add words and to sort of supplement. And that's a really cool aspect of being both the author-illustrator, even though I have more experience illustrating other people's words, is just that flexibility of getting to change them in tandem.
Yeah. One of the elements that sort of lives in between those two worlds is the labels that pop up on certain spreads that have a different font, so they look a little handwritten for, they label flowers or various items. So I'm curious how that came about, how that idea came about, and kind of what you were going for with that.
Yeah, the labels, so I sort of use labels sprinkled throughout the book, and that was one of those sort of random flashes of inspiration that I had when I was out on a walk one day, and I was thinking about the pictures that we all drew of our families when we were little. And this book starts out with a portrait of the family, and their names and ages are labeled over them. And that thinking about how we sort of all did that when we were young. This is my family, this is me, labeling the ages. And it made me also think of Richard Scarry books, which I loved when I was little, and just love that, like, kids look at books in such a detailed way, and I think the details that can be lost on adult readers are not lost on kids. Like, they take things in a very small way. And so I think calling attention to those pieces felt like a way of immersing them into what's happening in the scene. And I don't know if I have a little bit more time. There was a question that I wanted to expand on a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
So somebody had asked about that idea of trying to get sounds and smells and more of the senses to come across in the artwork. And I think one thing that I didn't mention that is a big part of my process when I'm first gathering those inspiration images, when I'm starting the artwork in a book, I also make a music playlist for every book that I work on, and they have movie soundtracks. And it's sort of all about like trying to immerse myself in some kind of an emotional tone that I feel like is related to the book. And so that's one way that I try to just like get myself immersed in the world of the book and thinking about what it feels like to be there. And then going out into the environment. The good thing about taking so long to complete a book was that I was able to go through many cycles of the seasons, and this book prominently features, it's structured by seasons. And so being able to go out and feel the wind and see, feel the temperatures. And so when trying to bring that into the artwork, a lot of that is really through the use of color. The temperature can come across in a scene by using warmer tones and yellows, and those colors feel warm to us when we look at them. And the beginning of this book, which has sort of this sad beginning, has a cool bluish palette, and so something about it feels colder, and then it warms up through towards the end of the book. And I think last showing, if you think about that autumn spread that I showed, movement is such a big part of showing the senses, being able to show wind and using diagonal lines to make it feel really active, and which actually John Rocco, that piece of the tiger under the water has these great diagonals, and so you get this feeling of movement happening. And then using horizontal lines can show a sort of stillness in the piece. So all of those things help in getting that across.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I will move on to John Rocco now. That's perfect. Hi, John.
And I will agree with what Eliza said. Yeah, angles of your composition definitely help tell a story, for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. Please, by all means. What I was going to start with was back to the starting point, which you mentioned a bit as far as how Susan's text was somewhat open to interpretation, which for me is very intriguing, and there's a certain depth of emotion in here that isn't directly named, but I think that people connect to. So I wonder if in your head you did name that emotion, or you made some personal connection that that allowed you to address it on a deeper level. Because for me, the book is very emotional.
Yeah, it certainly is. I think we go through all kinds of stages in our life when we're scared of the next transition, whatever that is. I know for myself, my life's been full of transitions, right? And they're all scary, no matter how old you are, right? So for me, I think calling upon help in a way, and is something that you can do to give you the courage and the confidence to move through that next transition. And so a tiger actually, I think in the zodiac, the tiger actually represents courage and confidence and things like that. So it's a perfect symbolism for what this kid, needs in his life. So for me, that kind of made the perfect representation. I didn't have to show the boy's emotions. I could use the tiger to sort of emote them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a lesson taught to me very early on in my career. I was at one of my first conferences, and I was speaking with 3 other people, Chris Crutcher, Christopher Paul Curtis. I'm saying that right? Yeah, I think so. And Eric Roman. And so Eric and I were the only illustrator authors there, and we had lunch together. And he looked at a book dummy of mine, and I had this duck on one of the pages. And he said, "You have to have that duck go all the way through the book." I said, "Why? It's not really important to the story." And he said, "Well, this is your character that's going to tell the audience how to feel. And you're going to let the boy be very still, and you're going to have this like little character who's going to exaggerate all of his emotions." And I thought that was a brilliant observation and a tool to use in a picture book. So it's kind of like a secondary character, almost like a jester in a way that will exaggerate the emotion or the energy that should be happening, even if your main character is very still, both emotionally and physically. And so with this book, it's really focused on the tiger, and he's sort of representing everything that this kid's going through.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Real quick, we are running a little short on time, but before I move on, it looks like the 5th grade class who is with us is asking, how old were you when you first considered yourself an illustrator, if you have any sort of inspirational words?
Yeah, for me, it didn't happen until I was about 18 years old, or maybe 19. I was already going to college to study engineering, and I was living with an illustrator. And he would sit in his room and paint pictures and drink coffee and listen to music, and I thought, this is the greatest career I've ever experienced. How do I do that? And I drew a little bit, but I was never one of those people that was like known to be a drawer. And so I spent a lot of time kind of putting together, what I thought would be a portfolio, and I went off to art school, and I kind of switched gears. And I think that's, a great lesson to anybody is you can switch gears until you're dead. You just keep going, try something new, I mean, up till 15 years ago, I worked as an art director in the entertainment business, and then I took off that hat and put on the hat of a children's book maker. And I'll continue to do that until it's no longer inspiring or fun, and try something different. What's stopping you, right?
Perfect.
You're never too old to learn something new.
That's right.
I love that.
That was inspirational, yeah. Very, very nice. Thank you, John, and we'll do
Thank you.
Weshoyot now. So part of your mission, as I understand it, is to help shape the telling of Native stories in general. And as you've said, you've done a lot of work in comics and other media. So if you could speak about kind of making the shift into picture books and some of the challenges with that, but also how it's different addressing a much younger audience, and what message you wanted to relate to young kids.
Yeah, certainly. Well, handling anything native-based currently in this current market it's such an exciting time to work. When I first started in comics, which is about 15, 20 years ago, I think the biggest hurdle was the fact that I was female and I was entering into a place of employment that was male-dominated, that very few females worked as artists, let alone maybe they wrote books or maybe they edited books. To see the discrepancies in genders close over the years. I mean, there's been so much push for more female-based stories in comic books, in publishing, since I started. And now I think the gender gap is closing. You're seeing that minorities are the next thing that the publishing world really needs to focus on, and to give representation to these people, and the fact that there's a huge market not only in education and schools for them to share this with, students who are minority, but also in the readership. Growing up, I started to sort of revisit a lot of children's books that I loved as a child once I got hired by Kokua, just to kind of refresh the things what did I love about these books? Why did they hit home? And a lot of them were, native-oriented stories, but a lot of them were actually drawn by non-native people or written by non-native people. And kind of seeing that as an adult, I see that there's certain things that are problematic. But at the same time, those were the only books that had any vague forms of representation for me to see as a kid. And yes, they did inspire me, and they still do. I think Peter Parnell is one of, the biggest inspirations for me as a kid. A lot of books, illustrated by him, and I think he worked with Berg Baylor. Those were ones that I still have in my collection, and I read to my kids. I think I never intended to use the fact that I was Native American in what I did as like a point, but over the last, I would say, at least 5-6 years, it's something that I felt more comfortable going into and expressing, because there have been more major publishers that are willing to accept what it is that you create with less editorial confines. So you can put something out there and they will respect the fact that, okay, she's coming from a place either representing her tribe or with just knowledge of, tackling that particular piece of either writing or art with maybe a little bit more insight than, say, a non-Native person would. And in publishers giving Native people more respect in that regard, I feel more comfortable sharing certain things and stories and putting my name on projects like At the Mountain's Base or like the Ghost River graphic novel that we are putting out at the end of the year.
Yeah, excellent. And we are out of time, but before we wrap up, Weshoyot, are there any other current Native artists or writers that we should be paying attention to? I know we have a lot of librarians who listen in. It might be good for collection development.
There's a publishing company called Native Realities Press, who's run and operated by Lee Francis. He is a writer, and I've teamed up with him on several books. He also works with many Indigenous artists. Dale DeForest would be one, Sean Bayali, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Aragon Starr, who is a female, she's Cherokee. She's a writer and artist and has her own comic called Super Indian that she's been doing for years and years. Michael Shayashi, Elizabeth LaPense. I would encourage people to go on Twitter, and they can follow me, and I'm constantly promoting other Native writers and artists and their projects.
Amazing. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. That will be the end of our Q&A. And
thanks, everybody, for listening in.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending.
And thanks for having us.
I will give the last word. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Go ahead.
I was just trying to give a little shout out, but I think Zeke covered it all when he started his talk. So just thank you to everybody who put this together.
Yes, thank you so much, Penguin.
Thank you.
And I will give the last
Yeah,
word
thank you all so much.
to Rachel Weiss, and she is the Associate Manager of School and Library at Penguin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to our 4 incredible illustrators. I just wanted to jump in and say if you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to reach me. My email is up on the screen, rweiss@penguinrandomhouse.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, tomorrow all attendees will receive an email containing a link to today's slide presentation, title list, and certificate of completion. You will also receive a notice when the video archive of today's webinar is posted at www.booklistonline.com/webinars. Please visit that same URL to learn more about Booklist webinars, view an archive of past webinars, or register for our upcoming webinars like the ones you see here. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the Booklist Reader, where Booklist editors and contributors are posting weekly about all things books and library land. Booklist has a digital edition of the magazine, which you can connect to your subscription online. This format pairs the page-by-page reading experience of print with the convenience of online access, and it's included free with all Booklist subscriptions. Not yet a subscriber? Take advantage of this special webinar offer to get print, online, digital, and archive access to Booklist for only $99. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, and one more thank you to all of our panelists, as well as our sponsor, Penguin Young Readers. This was great, and this concludes today's webinar.